Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the Iress Industry Forum on Design and Distribution Obligations. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Michael Blomfield. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer here at Iress, and I'm going to be speaking a little and doing a bit more emceeing of this call today. Look, earlier this month, we advised the industry that we at Iress were going to be, or are going to be, building out an end-to-end industry solution for DDO. I got to say, since then, we really have been genuinely inundated with emails, calls, and all forms of communications traffic on this topic. And so we thought the best way to answer all of those questions and bring you all together to think about this complex topic was to have this forum today. The agenda today is pretty simple. I'm going to talk a little bit about DDO as an industry challenge and why we think that an industry-wide solution is, not just an opportunity here, but really a necessity. Simun Soljo from Allens is going to join us then for about 10 minutes to talk about a legal perspective on this legislation. And then Gordon Little, who's the head of Iress Blockchain here, is going to talk to us about our solution, blockchain being part of that. It's not the be all and end all by any means, but it is important in the solution that we're thinking through and offering the market here. And look, we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. One thing I would remind you at the start is that there is a little Q&A tab down the bottom right of your screen. I'd invite you to put your questions in there. There is a raise the hand function. We're not going to take questions as we go today just to keep this nice and tight. But put your questions into the Q&A and we'll make sure we get to as many of those as we possibly can. Last thing I'll tell you by way of sort of administration is that we will be sharing these materials after the session. So you don't need to photograph screens. You don't have to feverishly take notes. We'll give you some info afterwards that will help you go from there. So DDO, Design Distribution Obligations. I think the first comment I'd make is that on the back of the Royal Commission, really, if anything came out of that, it was the obligation for all parties in the advice and wealth space to not just do the right thing, but to evidence the doing of the right thing. And to be able to, in very short order, be able to provide that evidence. And I think all of us can tell a story about some poor team that had to race out to somewhere never more appropriately named than Iron Mountain to find a box of documents that couldn't be found. And look, that was at the core of the Royal Commission, was the ability to evidence that things were being done and being done properly. DDO, along with advice fee consent, really is a regulatory response to that says, not only do you need to meet your client's best interests, you need to show that you're meeting those interests. And that is really at the heart of this regulation. We think that regulation on its face is relatively simple, right? There is a TMD, a target market determination. One has to test against that target market determination to check the suitability of the client for that and record the fact of that. That in and of itself sounds pretty simple, but I'm just going to walk you through quickly, I guess, a worked example to show you that this is vastly more complex than perhaps it's being understood to be. So we're going to start just by showing you a slide that really is about advice fee consent. And I do that because we see it as being on a continuum. Advice fee consent, the evidence that a client has opted into a service and has consented to the price of that service is a fairly simple thing in and of itself. And again, on the face of it, it seems like a very bilateral thing. I as an advisor, get my client's approval. That approval gets sort of shared and stored between us. And I'm just going to manually turn the lights on here. And it's as simple as that. But it is actually not as simple as that. So what happens with advice fee consent is that multiple parties want to evidence the fact that the planner has done that and the fact that the client has signed on for it. And so it becomes more complex. There becomes an interchange of information that is necessary for all parties to deliver on that, because a platform wants to know that the client has opted in, that the client has met, done an advice fee consent, that the planner is compliant for the platform to continue to do business. So there is more in the way of information exchange than perhaps had been understood at the get-go. DDO is a vastly more complex implementation of this. And this is very much at the heart of what Gordon will talk about. But it is why we at Iress believe that DDO requires not just a database solution, not just a place where TMDs can be stored, but what it actually creates is a very complex set of interactions that have to be recorded, monitored, reportable, and checked all along the way. And so you can see on this diagram, it is, I would argue, more simplified, in fact, than the reality is. But let me just sort of talk you through I guess an example of how this works, right? So the target market determination in and of itself is just an artifact that evidences that a product manufacturer has contemplated, has thought about the product's suitability for a specific classification of retail investor. Then when advice is given, the planner considers that and records the fact of that consideration. Now, ultimately, the planner, yes, is held to the higher bar of client best interest or best interest duty, but they still have to record the fact of this test, and they have to maintain records of all of the dealings around that so that that can be reported to the product issuer. So we have this already interconnectedness between an issuer of a product and a planner and a client, and remembering that more often than not, this is stored on platform. And by the way, this set of product issuers has been expanded from what we would normally think about as a product issuer to include, for example, but there are many others, insurance product, some insurance product and not all insurance product. And so all of those parties have to be aware, but there's sort of more than that as well. The platform needs to verify this. The planner needs to be able to check the ongoing validity and currency of the TMD. The issuer needs the right to reissue, amend, and advise a network, a network that doesn't exist currently, that this change has been made, that it's now in place, that the planner needs to be checking against it. We need to be able to record, for example, complaints. We need to be able to record examples or instances of personal advice. And if we get all of this right, we will actually have a very efficient system within the industry that allows the industry to communicate with each other in very standardized, reliable, easily reported on ways. It is a messaging system, sort of similar to something like Swift, similar to something like, any of the clearinghouse capabilities that exist in the marketplace, where we send message X to party Y, and we all know what message X means, and it can be, relied upon. And trust and reliability of the single source of truth in all of this is actually a really central issue. If I think about the alternative just for a moment, if each party in this industry, and remembering that the parties in this industry who are affected by DDO are in the thousands, from every IFA to every planner network, to every product manufacturer, to every platform, some of the brokers, some of the banks, some of the insurers, this vast network, if each of those parties attempts to bilaterally or singly solve this problem, we will end up in I don't know how to describe it except a spaghetti mess. It will be grossly inefficient. It will not meet the regulatory challenge of reportability. And we will have spent, as an industry, an extraordinary sum of money, each of us attempting to solve this internally and at a bilateral, when in fact, this regulation does really require a centralized communication and network that allows the industry to talk to each other. When we get that right, we will be able to monitor and manage the complexity of this situation. There will be 81-year-olds who are put into an aggressive long-short fund, and that will appear to be ridiculous and non-compliant, but we'll need to record that actually that 81-year-old is the patriarch of a family trust, and the family trust is going to flow through to someone who is currently 13, and on a time horizon basis, that makes perfect sense for the trust, but we need to know that, we need to evidence that. In 10 years' time, in 25 years' time, when that 81-year-old is sadly inevitably passed away, we still need to be able to come back to that piece of advice and be able to evidence that it was good and that it was real. That is the level of complexity that I think balloons all of this DDO obligation. We think that blockchain is a great solution for this. I, both individually and as a professional, has said for a long time that blockchain is a fantastic solution to a problem that's not yet been discovered. Well, my argument and Iress's argument is, here it is. Gordon is going to talk more about blockchain. What I do want to say before I hand to Simon shortly is that, look, blockchain for those, particularly on the institutional side, the product manufacturers, you'll want to engage with us around blockchain as a topic. We will give you the information you need. We'll work with you on that. I think for many of the planners on this call, what I'd like you to understand is that forget blockchain, actually. We don't walk around saying we've got this fantastic new solution and it's built in SQL, right? For most planners, let me say for all ex-plan planners, but we want to build this as industry utility, and so hopefully for our competitors as well. Planners will just engage with this via their desktop. They won't feel like they're engaging with the blockchain. They won't need new and special technology. They won't need to understand how messages work. We will provide an interface to this that is elegant and works in a way that integrates to the day-to-day of how you run your business. But it's the immutability of that at the core. Yeah, the single source of truth on all matters, including the messaging and the checking and the rechecking and the reissuance that is absolutely at the core of this. Look, at Iress, we've done this actually before. Many of you will know we already have blockchain running for fund pricing in Australia. We have in excess of 10,000 funds that are on that are reporting today. We've already delivered advice fee consent on the blockchain to ex-plan users. It's live in production today in advance of the regulation taking effect. We're a long way down this path. So, I leave you hopefully with a sense of A, the scope of this challenge is enormous, but B, it can be met simply if, as an industry, we make the right decision here. And that is self-evidently in Iress's best interest. We don't hide from that fact. But what is in our best interest here too is a much more efficient industry and not having a moment where a piece of regulation adds to the cost to serve, increases the challenge of profitability for financial planners, increases the price to the end consumer. That's an outcome that we should all be seeking to avoid, and we believe we can help avoid that. Now, what I'd like to do now is I'm going to hand to Simon Soljo. Simon's from Allens. He is going to talk to us about the regulatory aspects and the legal aspects of this, and then he'll hand back to me, and I'll introduce you to Gordon to say a few words. So over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks to Iress for inviting us to participate in the forum this morning. I am going to give a very, very high-level overview of the legal regime, which is the design and distribution obligations. This is really designed as an overview in order for us to identify some of the key issues which the regime brings up and which this solution, which Iress is building, it will be designed to solve. So the key issues the key obligations apply to both issuers of financial products and distributors. And I suppose the first thing to note is that an entity can be both an issuer and a distributor. An issuer is going to be distributing its own products by issuing them. There will also be entities that, such as IDPS providers, platforms, which issue their own product, which is the IDPS or the platform, but also distribute other issuers' products. And so there's an element of overlap of these obligations, and different providers are going to have different levels of obligations. So to start with the issuer obligations, as Michael mentioned, the bedrock of the DDO is really the target market determination which the issuer is going to make. And issuers are working to formulate the target markets for their products, thinking about distribution conditions and restrictions that should apply in order to make sure that products are distributed to people within the target market, looking at review triggers and the periods that should apply to reviewing the target market, and also looking at the sort of information that the issuer needs from distributors in order to be able to review the TMD and know whether a review trigger has occurred at any point in time. So this is really important work that issuers need to think about in formulating the TMD. The challenge which this, of course, immediately creates is the possibility that issuers are going to take different approaches, that they're going to have different review triggers, different review periods, different reporting requirements, different reporting periods, different distribution conditions which they'll impose on distributors. The industry bodies are working to some extent to address this issue. The ABA and the FSC are preparing or helping their members to prepare template versions of TMDs, but that's not going to solve the problem entirely, because those TMDs are really a starting point for issuers, and issuers will need to think for themselves about whether or not the template is appropriate, whether they need to specify their own review triggers and reporting information. And it doesn't solve the issue of what happens next after you make the TMD. So one of the big challenges for the industry will be the level of inconsistency between TMDs between issuers. The second point is that the issuer has to make the TMD publicly available. The law doesn't specify how that's going to happen. Issuers could make it available through a centralized website provided by the issuer. They could make it available in other ways. But I suppose the question is whether there's a smarter way to do that from an industry perspective, or whether distributors are going to need to go and work out for each issuer of products that they issue where exactly the TMD is in order to be able to track it down, and that could be quite difficult. The third obligation on the issuer is to take reasonable steps that mean that it's likely that product will be distributed consistently with the target market determination. So that means in practice and in short, that it's likely the product is going to be sold to somebody within the target market, and it's likely that the advice that's given is going to be consistent with the target market. That in practice means that issuers are going to be looking very closely at their distribution arrangements, both direct arrangements as well as their arrangements with distributors. Issuers that don't have formal arrangements with distributors may be looking to put them into place. Issuers may also be looking to revisit contractual arrangements with distributors, distribution agreements, looking at how they might need to beef those up and what additional provisions they might need to include in order to make sure that the issuer complies with their reasonable steps obligation. They might also need to look at what ongoing monitoring or review they need to put in place of distributors in order to meet their obligations. A lot of issuers will already have arrangements in place which will meet many of these considerations, But we know that issuers are looking at these arrangements. And so from a distributor perspective, you should expect to be talking to issuers of your products, and you should expect also to be negotiating new arrangements. Now, again, this introduces the possibility for inconsistency between issuers, and distributors might find themselves in a position where they are subject to different contractual requirements in relation to DDO for different issuers. You may be negotiating different arrangements at the same time, or with an end date of 5th of October when everything has to be in place. The fourth obligation is around reviewing the TMD. The issuer needs to review the TMD at the regular intervals, the regular review periods that are specified in the TMD, but also in response to events or circumstances that might suggest that the TMD is no longer appropriate. And this will include reports that the issuer will get from distributors, which I'll come back to. The fifth obligation is the issuer themselves needs to notify ASIC of significant dealings in their product, which is inconsistent with the TMD. And they need to do that within 10 business days of becoming aware of the inconsistent dealing. Now, issuers are going to need to consider and think through, well, what is a significant dealing from their perspective? And it may be different from the perspective of a distributor, which has its own obligation to report significant dealings, which I'll come back to also. Lastly, there's significant record keeping obligations on issuers. They need to record decisions they make in relation to TMDs and review of TMDs. They also need to keep records of distribution information, so complaints they receive, the reasonable steps they're taking to distribute products consistently with the TMD, as well as reported information that they receive from distributors. In relation to the distributors, the key obligations are the following. First of all, distributors need to confirm if a TMD has been made for a product or required. There is an exception for what's referred to as excluded conduct, which is basically giving advice and arranging for a client to acquire a product in order to implement the advice. But ASIC suggests that a TMD would need to be taken into consideration by distributors in formulating their advice and complying with their best interest duty. Now, there's no legal requirement to do that, but that is ASIC's expectations in the Reg Guide 274. Of course, if you're, as I mentioned, if you're a distributor who is giving advice to clients and wants to access the TMDs, the first challenge might be locating them and making sure that you are looking at the current TMD for the product. If different issuers are taking different approaches to making available their TMDs, and they may be updating them regularly at different times, that could be a practical challenge. The second obligation is, again, to take reasonable steps in the distribution of the product to ensure it's consistent with the TMD. Now, again, there is an exception for excluded conduct, so that's advice and implementation of advice by arranging. But outside of personal advice, there is an obligation to take reasonable steps, and the question will be, what is reasonable in the circumstances from the distributor's perspective? As I mentioned, there will also need to be likely to be contractual arrangements with the issuer, which distributors are going to need to negotiate, agree, implement in their own business. Whether or not personal advice is given, so even if personal advice is given and a dealer is relying on that exception, you will need to notify the issuer of significant dealings in the product that are inconsistent with the TMD. The question is going to be, well, what is a significant dealing from the distributor's perspective? The law is not prescriptive about that. Does the issuer have a view about what a significant dealing is? Will the issuer have a form of report that the distributor needs to provide? There is no standard form set out in the law. And again, there's the potential for different issuers to require different forms of report from their distributors. So a dealer group might be faced with different significant dealings reporting obligations for different product issuers. There is also an obligation to report that information within 10 business days of becoming aware, which is quite a short time frame. So that means putting in place a governance process around identifying and forming a view about significant dealings that are outside the TMD, and then having a process in place to report that to the issuer in the format that's agreed. The distributor will also be required to report other information. So there's an obligation to report complaints information, as well as other information that's specified by the issuer in the TMD. And issuers will include information that they want to receive in order to enable them to form a view about whether a review trigger has occurred for their product. So it may be very product specific and product category specific. And again, the TMD will specify the reporting periods for each of those categories of information. So what that means again is the potential for different reporting requirements across different issuers with different reporting periods that might apply. And that obviously suggests that there will be a strong incentive for the industry to come together and agree some standards around that. Finally, there's an obligation on issuers, on distributors, to keep records in relation to complaints they receive, as well as distribution information. So the reasonable steps they're taking to comply with the TMDs, as well as reported information that they've sent to the issuer. And that reporting obligation, these reporting obligations and the record keeping obligations apply regardless of whether the distributor is providing personal advice or general advice. So that's a bit of an overview of the legal issues, both for issuers and distributors. The issues raised are obviously complex, and working through each of them is going to take a lot of time for individual issuers. But the important thing to note is that there is a huge amount of reporting and connection between issuers and distributors, which this regime is going to introduce, which is one of the reasons why Iress is looking at it. So, Michael, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Appreciate that. We might just take a couple of quick questions before we get to Gordon, if you're okay with that, Simon. There's
sure.
A few here in the chat, and I'm sure all of the warnings apply, right? Around this not being legal advice nor investment advice and so on. But look, the first one I just thought is a pretty simple one we might put to you. Is that question is in-house investment management for an MDA, is that captured in DDO? So it's the manufacturing and the investment decision making around a managed discretionary account, which is then held on platform and probably distributed separately. But is that MDA provider captured in the DDO regulation, in your expert opinion?
Well, the MDA product issuer is certainly going to be captured because they're issuing a product to the client, and the advisor who's providing the advice, if that advice is given to the client, which you'd expect it would also be captured. But you would expect that the advice would line up with the portfolio that they're constructing for the client. But yes, both the issuer and the advisor in that case would have obligations. If the advisor is giving personal advice to the client, well, obviously then the exceptions that apply to personal advice will apply.
Thanks. The next one is, I think, one that's on a lot of people's minds, and it really goes to ongoing advice. So let me simplify the question. Is is the obligation for a financial planner to check against the TMD only live at the point of acquisition of that product? Or does it remain live? And I guess the test might be when we come around to an annual review, is it at the annual review point, should all the TMDs be checked again?
So the obligation applies both in relation to issuing the product as well as giving advice on the product. So if a product has been issued to a client at a certain point in time and a year later or 2 years later, an advisor is giving advice to the client about that product, then if it's general advice, then yes, the obligation applies in order to take that TMD into account and to take reasonable steps so that the advice is consistent with the TMD. As I said, if it's personal advice, ASIC has an expectation that you would take the TMD into account. That's the TMD at the time you're preparing the personal advice in order to comply with your best interest obligations.
Well, the questions are starting to roll in, but so thank you, Simon. What we might do for now, we will come back to questions, is hand over to Gordon Little. Many of you will know Gordon. Gordon heads up the Iress blockchain team here. He's was a founding partner in BC Gateways, which Iress acquired in 2019. And he's pretty instrumental in helping, I think, fund managers and financial services generally understand and realise some of the benefits of blockchain in reducing risk, reducing cost, and increasing accuracy. So over to you, Gordon.
Thanks, Michael. As you've all heard from Michael and Simon, the DDO legislation imposes obligations on the industry that require us to create and share information with counterparties with whom we may or may not have existing connectivity today, and for which we need evidence these interactions happen. And this is really interesting because this was actually very much behind why we started BC Gateways and blockchain and financial services. You have a lot of interactions with parties that need to share data on a daily basis for whom there isn't existing protocols, manual, email, website scraping, etc. So DDO is the perfect example of where this use case can really add value to reduce risk, minimize cost, etc. So might just look though, because we've much the time, and we just move through. Let's just talk about the issuer journey, the distributor journey, and then our solutions. So maybe we can move to slide 9. Yeah. Or do I have to share? Okay. Thank you, Kelly. So my background is funds management and investor services, so I'm more familiar on the issuer side probably than the distributors. But what I say from the issuers that's really interesting here is, as you heard from Simon, there's a lot that goes into creating the TMD that you need to understand about your product, who you're targeting to sell it to, and making sure it aligns with your PDS, etc. Now, if everyone had developed their own standards, this would be problematic. So fortunately, the FSC and its members are well advanced in developing standards for this. And what this will allow us to do is accelerate the digitization and the aggregation for downstream consumption. So I think there's going to be somewhere between 12 and 15,000 TMDs in the market. And if we had to just aggregate all those in PDS, read them, we would be introducing a massive amount of time and inefficiency. So we need to be able to digitize these documents and work towards standards in the industry. But once the TMD is created, it doesn't end there. They need to distribute it. And it's not always clear to the issuer who needs their TMD. An example of this is you've got a fund manager. They're on 10 platforms. There's 10 licensees under each of the platforms, and there's 1,000 advisors. So times that by the 200 fund manager brands in the market, and you realize that's a lot of point-to-point interactions. On the fund manager or the issuer of the product, the issuer won't always know the advisor or the investor because they're disintermediated there. But in this case, how do they get comfort that the actual person selling their product has understood the TMD and put the right client in it? So this is the challenge for the issuers, is being able to evidence that once they've created the TMD, that it's being used properly, they're getting reporting back, and that they're able to satisfy themselves on their obligations. So let's maybe move to the distributor journey. So for distributors, there's a whole bunch of challenges here, including just getting access to all of those TMDs, ensuring the TMDs align to their clients and they fit their target profile, and then ensuring that any changes to the TMD are understood and that they're made aware that there's changes to TMDs or where TMDs are revoked. And then after they put their clients into it, there's reporting obligations. So that's significant dealings, there might be complaints, there could just be questions about, have I understood this correctly? What do you mean by this? So there's a number of interactions that the distributors will need to have with the issuers that today you might have to be going to websites, calling call centers. Are you actually going to get to the right person, answer your question in a timely manner? So what is Iress doing about it? And how are we looking at solving this problem? So as Michael said, we're looking to leverage our blockchain technology to underpin the solution that helps both issuers and distributors to meet their obligations. And there's three main components to this. The first is the creation of the TMD and then making it available to the distributors. So what we're doing there is we're using our blockchain where we collect all other types of fund data, PDSs, et cetera. We're allowing issuers to upload their TMDs. Right now, we think there's about 7 different, possibly 8 different variants of TMDs for insurance, super, et cetera. We will hash those documents. We will load them into the blockchain, and then we'll make them available downstream to the distributors. So if you're an Xplan user, it will just be part of the solution to that you'll receive today when you look at the tools within Xplan to make recommendations. You won't have to go and connect to the blockchain, as Michael said, but we'll make sure that everyone's aware of the TMDs and has access to them. And a key point of this is our notifications, where if a TMD is updated, if it's revoked, we will send notifications to those people who are subscribed to that product. And the way that works in the blockchain is you put your APLs, you put your target products in the blockchain, and if any event happens around that product, around their TMD, you'll get notified that that's changed, and you might need to take action on your end if you're a distributor. So that's the first part of it, the underpinning. We've captured the TMDs, we've made them available to people distributing products, and we are allowing distributors to have access to them. On the Xplan side, and Emily Chen's online, she's our global head of Xplan, and I'm sure she can answer any of the questions that I can't, but our view on this is we will make the data within the TMDs available through the Xplan software so that it's there for you when you're making recommendations, and it's built within the current workflow of the way you use the system today. And for licensees, we're going to allow whole of licensee level reporting so you can aggregate across your advisors and then meet your obligations to report back. And that's both of those are the blockchain will be available in May, and so that we can start to aggregate the TMDs at that point as we work to build out the information in Xplan. The third part, which is probably the most interesting, and this is really what the FSC was looking to solve, and many of its members, and I get asked this question all the time: how can we solve the problem of the many to many? And so what we've looked at doing is building a message service on top of the blockchain. And this really goes to Michael's comments about evidence, where we're going to create a add-in in Xplan and an add-in in Outlook for other users, where you can click on it when you want to create a message. We'll call it the DDO add-in, the DDO messaging. Come up, you say, put your TMD number in. It'll tell you who the issuer of that TMD is, and then you can put your complaint, your significant dealings, or questions in that document. And then it will route it to the issuer. And during the routing, it will hash it and put it into the blockchain. Evidence that it happened. And this is really critical to the whole problem of proving that something happened. And I will just give you my background on this. In running big registry, something like 2,000 advisor client changes a month. So when you go back and you look at what happened 5 years ago in an event, it is almost impossible with the movement around the industry. So what this will give us, and it's a permission blockchain, so you make it available to the people who need to consume it. And the publisher decides who the people are consuming it on, and then the consumer can access it and use it as they need. But over time, it becomes the memory of the industry for these events. So at some point in 7 years, someone go, Gordon Little, did he sign all of his advice fee consents? Was he involved in any significant dealings where he got the wrong product? Did he make a complaint? And regardless of which advisor, which issuer, you'll be able to evidence that those events happened. So we think this is critical to the complete end-to-end solution, whereby we're allowing issuers to communicate with all chains down to the distributor. And it could be the RE, the trustee of the product. It could be the licensee, the platform, or the actual advisor themselves. So there's a range of levels there. And depending on where the TMD was issued, so a TMD could be issued for a fund manager to a platform. That platform then wraps it, puts another TMD on top of it, and sends it to an advisor, or makes it available for sale through an advisor. The advisor sells it. Who is the actual complaint going to? Is it the underlying fund, or is it the platform who's repackaged it, or maybe it's both? So that's the way we're thinking about designing this, so that you can have access to the people who need to see that information. And that's a lot of detail in a very short time, so I might just pause there, Michael, and hand back for questions.
Thanks, Gordon. Appreciate it. We do have a ton of questions coming in. I think we'll do our best to get through them. I've just realised there's a whole bunch in chat as well as in Q&A. I'm going to start with Q&A. Apologies to the chatters. I guess the first one I'll take, which is the question is, or the statement is, it makes sense to have one complete industry approach, but have we, Iress, been in discussions with ASIC about this? And look, with all the respect in the world to ASIC, I think what they would say is this is the industry's obligation, and Iress, if there's a part you play in meeting that, well, we'd invite you to do that, but they don't back horses. And so we've been in very limited discussion with ASIC. I certainly don't think there's any mandate coming, and I think nor should there be properly. The question next is from Wendy Mann about if Iress provides this solution, how will we ensure the price remains competitive? And look, this goes to a question that I've been asked, a number of times already, which is people, I guess, have some fear that this is a monopolistic play or a monopolistic opportunity. Look, that is absolutely in no way our intention to price monopolistically. I can't give you much confidence other than to tell you that that's true. What I would say, though, is that in the end, price is a function of complexity. Yeah. If the industry in the end implements a vastly complex solution, irrespective of the line item prices for delivery, that will be an enormously expensive solution for the industry, enormously. If the industry finds a way to manage this centrally through an environment that scales elegantly, then pricing, can be made available that recognises that, and that has to be a vastly lower cost. Now, we asked a couple along the way. Lindsay is asking, is it okay to have a TMD that's specific around things like liquidity when the PDS provides the issuer numerous discretions and qualifications around things like liquidity? Or should you word the TMD similar to the PDS to protect the issuer? I think, Simon, that's absolutely one for you if you want to bring yourself on screen. Is Simon there?
Hi, Michael.
Thank you, mate.
Can you see me? Sorry, Michael, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So is it okay to have a TMD that is specific around things like liquidity when the PDS provides the issuer numerous discretions and qualifications around something like liquidity? Or do you word the TMD similar to the PDS to protect the issuer? Do you say that a TMD must be read in conjunction with the PDS, the AIG? I think this is the question around where does the PDS start and finish, where's the TMD start and finish, and where are protections and appropriate risks made clear?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really difficult one. There isn't a yes or no answer to this question. The starting point, as far as the law is concerned, is that you wouldn't need to include a lot of the product details that are in the disclosure document in the TMD. Unfortunately, ASIC took a different line in the regulatory guide. It expects issuers to set out the key product features and attributes, and then to link them to the target market and explain why those product features and attributes are appropriate for the target market that's been identified. So things like liquidity of the product might be an appropriate thing to include in describing the product attribute and in explaining why the particular liquidity features of that product are appropriate for the target market that's been identified. But that's the sort of thing issuers are currently thinking through.
Clear as mud, Simon. Thanks very much. The next question is from Tim Kelly. And as an issuer of an MIS, there are a number of third-party distributors that operate between the MIS manager, the AFSL holder, and the retail investor. But I think, Tim, we've lost the rest of your question. I think, however, that this is a real point that people are looking for some clarity around is many products are offered on platform. And I think Gordon just gave an example of, you've got a set of products that go to feed something like an SMA that's then offered on platform, often in multiple variants, and then provided out to distributors. Where does the TMD obligation sit? Does it sit at the SMA level? Does it sit at the sub-product level? Does it sit at both levels? Simon, have you formed a view on that?
I suppose the short answer is it could sit at both levels. So you look at what's the product that's being issued to the client. Now that might be an interest in a managed investment scheme. It could be a custodial or depository service, which is also caught by DDO. So it could be an IDPS. There is a product being issued to the client, which the client holds. And so that product will have to have a TMD if the product is being issued to retail clients. Now, that product might provide other accessible products to the client or access to other products through the platform. And the client might need to be given a PDS for those products, which then brings them into the regime. And so a TMD might need to be made for those underlying products by the separate product issuers of those products. So the answer is it could be both, and the platform provider could be both an issuer of its own product as well as a distributor of other people's products. Yes,
I think it's the only possible response to that. Yes. I hope that answers a bunch of people's questions, including I know Kate Anderson's asked one in the chat around this. This is kind of exactly the issue that we got to thinking about, that tells us that an industry network, an industry communication system is what's required here, because checking the component parts of all of this discreetly, I think is just going to be next to impossible. Sean, sorry, there's another question around how does an MIS manager deal with grandfathered distribution arrangements? Gee, I'd hope that we're not having to deal with many of those at this point in time. But I think the distribution arrangement, the remuneration that really the grandfathering speaks to is a separate issue to the TMD. Again, I think we come back to this test that where a client's advice is renewed, and that whether that's because of a change in life stage, moving from accumulation to retirement, whether that's, I think, an annual review that essentially reinstitutes the advice for the next year. And I think what Simon's told us is that really at that point, TMDs have got to be checked. And so whether they're grandfathered or otherwise, I think this test applies. We've only got 8 minutes left. We're going to try and get through as many as we can. Sean McGowan's asked a question here. If we only provide personal advice, it's a double negative, Sean, does DDO not apply? So if we only provide personal advice, Simon, does DDO apply?
Yes, it does, is the short answer. Some of the obligations you're relieved from. So as I said, the reasonable steps obligation from an issuer's perspective, so you can recommend to your clients that they be put into a product for which they may be outside the target market. That would be something you'd be able to do, but you still have reporting and record keeping obligations. If you're putting clients into a product where a significant number of them are outside the target market, that could be a significant dealing outside the target market, which you might need to report to the issuer. And then the issuer needs to think about, well, if my advisors or my dealers are putting people into this product that I don't think should be in it, what do I do in response to that? Am I comfortable with that as long as they're getting personal advice, or would I actually prefer to restrict who comes into my product through the distribution conditions I impose on my dealers or through product eligibility?
Yeah. Sean's asked a second question, which really is about if you put a client into a product and they then sever the relationship, the advice relationship, does the advisor have a continuing obligation to meet the TMD requirements, or do they remove them from the product? I think we both know the answer there is if a client severs the relationship, it's been severed. Your obligations to them cease at that point, but they don't cease to have existed when they existed. And this is a really important point, I think, because again, where the Royal Commission got to, this is about saying, well, this person was a client in 2019. In 2021, they are not a client. But when you gave them that advice in 2019, what evidence can you provide about the suitability? And capturing that and storing that in a place that is easily accessed and has reporting inherent to it is going to be the answer that solves the problem. Tara's asking about what are we anticipating the factors that will be the factors in the TMD, or I guess the data fields in the TMD. I think, you know, the FSC and others are providing some clarity around something approaching an industry standard, and then we hope it becomes industry standard that go to address that. Simon made the point earlier that firms in and of themselves, though, may want to go further. And so Tara's raised the issue of something like financial literacy. That is something that the issuer of the TMD may want to consider. If planners at the other end want to consider financial literacy, and then that is an issue that will need to be addressed. At the moment, we think that within the X-Plan environment, and I'm sure inside planning technology environments generally, that the issue to be solved here is the connection and the ongoing suitability tests and the ability to record the fact of those. When will the Iress solution be available? Well, Gordon, do you want to speak to that? There was a question, by the way, when does it start? The 5th of October is the effective implementation date of the regulation. We at Iress recognise that no firm could just hope that we made it by the 5th of October. So we're planning to go ahead of that. Gordon, do you want to speak to timelines?
So for the capture and dissemination of the TMD, we'll be ready in June to start that. And I think that's really important for a whole range of people, because there's a cascading effect in the TMDs. You need other people's TMDs to create your TMDs. So we'll be able to capture those in the blockchain from June. And then we'll be working through user groups on the messaging layer and X-Plan to make sure that as people get their heads around the legislation, the tools fit for purpose. but both will be available well before October. And
Okay.
Michael, they've asked about open standards. So we're going to be using open standards. It's fully open API. We're going to, as much as possible, where the industry comes up with templates, those will be our standard. And we will make this available to everybody. So brokers, any insurers, everybody who wants to use this platform to publish their TMDs and make them available, we will work with.
Indeed, and I think that goes to answer a bunch of questions, including how do TMDs get into Xplan. In reality, I think for all advice software, in reality, they won't. What will happen is, if we have this solution in place, is that the TMDs will live in the Iress blockchain environment, and systems will come and ping that environment to test and check. And that allows them to be stored once centrally in a highly efficient way. Now, look, we've only got 3 minutes left. I think it's probably a good time to wrap it up. We have been inundated with questions. We will try and find a way to answer those. I'm looking at Kelly, who I'm now putting on the hook for this, but we will try and find a way to provide answers back to all of these via the materials that we're going to distribute. And that's the point that Kelly just handed to me. So look, thank you everyone very much for your time this morning. I hope that this has helped. It's probably scared the hell out of a few people. Apologies if that's the case, but I think in a sense, that's the point. The DDO regulation is, on the face of it, relatively simple, and on the implementation of it, extraordinarily interconnected and therefore complex. A database of TMDs sitting somewhere will not solve this problem alone. It has to be answered, if it's to be efficient, through an industry-wide communication network that allows the storing of the artifact, the communication that's required around the artifact, the reporting and the ability to go back in history and find out what happened in a centralized and reportable way. That's the system that Iress is looking to bring to the market. We want to work with everyone to do that, every part of industry, and anyone who wants to be involved as we build this out for the industry, using the industry as our advisors to do that. Don't hesitate to get in touch. We'd love to be working with you. Thank you very much for your time today. All the best. Hope everyone gets an Easter break, and we'll speak to you all anon. Thank you very much, Simon, for your time today. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, ball boys.